things we care about. Now, another way of measuring timing, which does not depend on your ability to pick peaks, is to look at phase. And we know that if you take any signal, if it changes in time, phase is just the other side of the coin. And so you can take any two signals and compare their relative phase differences. Similarly, you can take any brain response and compare how is the nervous system representing the differences in phase. And so if you take a stimulus, for example, like ga and ba, and you compare the two, here there's no phase difference, and here where there is a phase difference, you can see that that very clearly shows up. And so this is now automated and very easy to perform this particular calculation. If you want to know how good is the nervous system at telling apart a B, a ba from a ga, for example. And importantly, again, there's this relationship where the better the nervous system is at pulling out the phase, the better their speech and noise. And again, the better the speech and noise, the better the phase representation. And importantly, there's a musician advantage. Okay, so musicians are, again, better at extracting this timing that is important for the representation of sounds that are important for our communication. Okay, so this transfer of music and speech. Work that has been done in Ravi Krishnan's lab has also shown that musicians show an advantage in the representation of their harmonics if sounds are presented in increasingly challenging and reverberant conditions. And it's actually the work from Ravi Krishnan's lab that motivated me to start the music work in the first place, because he showed years ago that language experience, so he looked at the brainstem responses of tone language speakers, and he found that people who speak tonal languages are better, their nervous system, their brainstem just better represents tonal pitch changes than people who are not using tonal languages in their daily communication. So that experience dependence to me was extremely intriguing. So your nervous system becomes the way it is based on how you use it. In the same way, you go to the gym, you work out your bicep, and it's going to be as big or little as it is, and formed however it may be, whether you're awake or asleep, because of how you have spent your life up until that point. Okay, so how does memory fit in? So the argument here is that strengthened cognitive abilities in musicians may contribute to these subcortical enhancements. And we did one study where behaviorally we looked at measures of attention, and we found, this is a reaction time, we found that in adult musicians that they were better at an auditory attention task than their counterpart non-musicians. We didn't see a difference in visual attention, just in auditory attention. Now, musical training involves the memorization of sounds and visual patterns. It involves the memorization of auditory and motor sequences. Just to tune your instrument, you've got to remember what the note sounds like. If you're going to improvise, you have to remember what you listen to your friend playing a snippet, and if you're going to improvise on it, you have to remember what that is in order for you to improvise upon it. And so all of this exercises memory. I'm going to give you a personal example of me trying to learn a little piece of a Chuck Berry lead, and how I'm going to need to keep refreshing my memory. So you're going to hear, I'll be pointing here, you'll be hearing Chuck. It's going to be very obvious who's playing. And so here's me trying to remember what he played, and I still keep it in my memory a little bit. I can try it again, but then I forget. I've got to listen to him again, and after many, many tries, I get it, sort of. important, right? And you know, there have been a number of studies that have looked at, have given us biological cues and clues for why it is that musicians have this enhanced memory. And in the study that Gab and Schlaug did, they had matched their participants in terms of their discrimination abilities and had these musicians and non-musicians perform a pitch discrimination task, and found that the musicians utilized different brain regions, regions that are more classically and characteristically associated with memory tasks than the non-musicians. And the non-musicians really were relying more heavily on sensory areas than the musicians were. So this is interesting. We also know that the mismatch negativity is a neural response that reflects the nervous system's ability to detect a change, and it is a measure of echoic memory. And so, for example, if you take a sequence of sounds and then you add a change to it, then the nervous system just automatically will give you an indication, this is primarily a cortical response, of whether or not a change has occurred. And we know that musicians, in general, need less of a change between sounds in order for the nervous system to tell that there's a difference, and particularly so in timing. A musician will be able to, their nervous system will pick up a 20 millisecond timing difference between a standard and a deviant stimulus, whereas a non-musician might need as much as 50 milliseconds. And again, this transfer of music and speech is that these differences on the order of 20 milliseconds, this is what will distinguish a ba, is it a bill or a pill? Your nervous system needs to be able to resolve these millisecond differences to tell these things apart. So there have been a number of studies then that have shown that musicians are just better at auditory memory. And the trainer in Corrigan will have a nice review of many of the cognitive enhancements that we can see in musicians. And the jury's out, you know, as to how specialized this is in the auditory modality, or the extent to which it also extends to the visual system. So in our studies, what we do is we test auditory working memory. And again, we're using standardized tests, and we're interested in people's ability to hold information in memory and then to tell us what it is that they remember. So for example, we might give them a string of items and numbers and say, I want you just to repeat back the numbers, or repeat back the items backwards. So you have to hold the information in your mind and repeat it back, and of course the tests get harder and harder. And what we find is that with musical experience across the lifespan, people with musical experience are just better at these tasks. And we are not seeing a relationship, at least at the moment, with visual working memory. This really seems to be very specific to the auditory modality. And importantly, back to this issue of hearing and noise, is that people's working memory ability is related to their hearing and noise ability. And so in other words, the better your working memory, the better you are at hearing speech and noise. Why would that be? If you're listening to your friend in a noisy restaurant, you have to not only be able to hear what they're saying, you have to remember what they said about a second ago if you're going to make sense of anything that they're saying right now. Okay, so you need to have good working memory as well as being able to hear the signal. So working memory is really very, very important, especially in more challenging listening circumstances. So we have been looking then at these neural indices and how they might relate to a working memory ability. And what we see, again, is if we look at stimulus to response correlations, we see a very strong relationship between the magnitude of the stimulus to response correlation, this is in the brainstem, the neural response, and working memory ability. Also, remember I told you about these quiet to noise shifts. We wondered, well, are these quiet to noise shifts also related to memory ability? And in fact, yeah, musicians have this less quiet to noise shift, but what's important here is that the better their working memory, the less of a noise shift that they have, okay? So again, this cognitive ability seems to be related to a very basic auditory biological processing of sound. And again, we don't see a relationship with vision. And so these are the same experiments again. We really are using this overarching theoretical and experimental approach across the age span. We see this in young adults, and the same relationship in older adults. So this seems to function across the age span. One of the important aspects that we know in terms of the representation of sound that the nervous system is good at is in the representation of the harmonics. And so we wondered whether there was a relationship between this representation of the harmonics that is just better in musicians and working memory. And in fact, we really do see that the magnitude of the harmonics is related to how good working memory is. We see this in school-age children, and we see this in young adults. And yeah, so let me just try to put some of this together. So the way that we're thinking about it is that speech and noise perception and auditory working memory, okay, we already know that these are related. And you know, in a certain way, we find that we're kind of chasing this dog is chasing its tail around. But we think that there is kind of an anchoring point with the auditory working memory. Because both speech and noise perception and auditory working memory are related, and they both relate to the neural processing of sound. But what we're speculating is that the auditory working memory is important in mediating this relationship between speech and noise perception and the neural processing of sound. And the reason we think that is because in some cases, auditory working memory and speech and noise perception both relate to the neural processing of sound, but in many cases, the relationship with speech and noise is weaker than the relationship that we see with auditory working memory. We also see that sometimes the relationship with speech and noise and some of our neural measures is just absent, where we see that with auditory working memory, these relationships they're there in the first place. And we never see the situation where there is a relationship between the neural measure and speech and noise perception without the memory. So the memory always has to be there. And so it leads us to speculate, at least, that auditory working memories, that this cognitive influence is a factor that is driving our biological outcomes. And so this is one of the things that we're poised to look at developmentally and in